There is a secret tucked away in the deep, temperature-controlled archives of a museum in Washington, D.C. A single weather-beaten journal bound in cracked bison leather that holds one of the quietest, yet most profoundly astonishing chapters of the American story. It was written before the great interstate highways carved their asphalt ribbons across the deserts, long before the neon electric glow of the cities rose up to erase the Milky Way from the night sky. The pages inside speak of an America so incredibly vast, so untouched and deeply silent that early travelers swore they could hear the very heartbeat of the earth beneath their boots. The men who wrote these pages walked into a towering emerald abyss in the uncharted West and found a living monument so impossibly massive it defied human comprehension and changed the map of the world forever. So, lay back. Let your shoulders drop into the mattress. Allow the heavy, chaotic noise of the modern world to simply melt away into the background. We are leaving the present behind, drifting backward in time to the crisp, untamed autumn of 1851, stepping into a forest where time itself seems to stand perfectly still. The frantic, desperate energy of the California gold rush was roaring hundreds of miles to the north, a chaotic symphony of pickaxes, muddy rivers, and crowded boom towns. But here, deep in the forgotten western slopes of the Sierra Nevada mountains, there was only the profound, heavy silence of the ancient wilderness. The air was different here. It was thin, incredibly pure, and carried the sharp, intoxicating scent of crushed pine needles, damp earth, and the faint, sweet aroma of wild cedar. A small party of topographical surveyors, led by a quiet, observant man named Elias, was moving slowly through the dense underbrush. They were not looking for gold. They were looking for the blank spaces on the map, tasked by the government to chart the winding rivers and deep canyons that no mapmaker had ever seen. As they marched, the rhythm of their footsteps became a slow, steady meditation. The crunch of dry autumn leaves beneath heavy leather boots, the occasional soft snort of the pack mules, and the gentle creaking of the saddle leather were the only sounds breaking the absolute stillness of the afternoon. The sunlight in this part of the world did not just shine. It poured down like warm liquid amber, filtering through the dense canopy of evergreen branches above and pooling in bright, golden patches on the forest floor. Elias rode at the front, his wool coat buttoned tight against the creeping mountain chill. He noticed how the shadows were beginning to stretch, growing longer and softer as the afternoon surrendered to the approaching twilight. They had been climbing in elevation for 3 days, leaving the dusty foothills of the San Joaquin Valley far behind. With every mile they gained, the forest around them seemed to shift, growing older, denser, and more majestic. The trees here were not like the slender pines of the East Coast. These were titans, their bark a rich burnt cinnamon color, deeply grooved and thick enough to withstand the hottest forest fires. But what they were about to discover was something far greater than any ordinary pine. As the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in deep, bruised shades of violet, indigo, and fiery orange, the expedition reached the crest of a high, rocky ridge. Elias pulled softly on the reins, bringing his horse to a halt. The men behind him stopped, one by one, their voices falling completely silent. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Below them lay a valley wrapped in a thick, silvery blanket of evening fog, and rising out of that fog were shapes that made no logical sense to the human eye. At first, Elias thought it was a trick of the fading light. He blinked, rubbing his tired eyes, but the massive silhouettes remained. They looked like towering red pillars holding up the very ceiling of the sky. These were the giant sequoias. Until this very moment, no written record of their existence had ever been sent back to the libraries of the East Coast. The sheer scale of them was paralyzing. Their trunks were so impossibly wide that a horse and wagon could be driven through them, and their highest branches disappeared into the darkening clouds, hundreds of feet above the earth. These living monuments had been growing quietly in this hidden valley since before the Roman Empire fell, before the first ships ever crossed the Atlantic, silently adding a single microscopic ring of wood to their trunks year after year, century after century. A deep, overwhelming sense of peace washed over the camp as they realized the magnitude of what they had stumbled upon. They guided their mules slowly down the slope, entering the grove, just as the first stars began to pierce through the velvet purple canopy of the night. Walking among these giants felt like stepping into an ancient open-air cathedral. The forest floor was covered in a carpet of rust-colored needles that was feet thick, softening every footstep into a gentle, muffled thud. Elias signaled to make camp at the base of a particularly massive tree, its cinnamon bark glowing faintly in the dim starlight. The men worked in a quiet, synchronized rhythm that comes from months of traveling together. They gathered dry, fallen branches, the wood snapping with a satisfying, crisp sound. Soon, the bright, cheerful spark of flint striking steel ignited a small tuft of dry moss. A delicate ribbon of white smoke curled upward, followed by the warm, comforting crackle of a campfire. The flames danced and flickered, casting long, rhythmic shadows that swayed gently against the massive wooden walls of the trees surrounding them. The night air grew sharp and cold, a stark contrast to the radiant warmth of the fire. The men unpacked their heavy woolen blankets, wrapping themselves tight, leaning back against their saddles. A blackened iron pot was suspended over the flames, and soon the rich, dark aroma of roasted coffee began to drift through the camp, mingling with the scent of wood smoke and pine resin. It was a smell that spoke of safety, of warmth, and of the simple grounding comforts of the American frontier. No one spoke much. The sheer magnitude of the trees seemed to demand a respectful, awe-filled silence. Elias sat with his leather-bound journal resting on his knee, a charcoal pencil held loosely in his hand. He tried to find the words to describe the scale of the forest, but the language of measurement felt entirely inadequate. Instead, he simply sketched the texture of the bark, the deep grooves that felt like canyons under his fingertips. He noted how the massive root systems gripped the earth with an unbreakable hold, tethering these ancient beings to the rocky soil of the Sierra Nevada. As the night deepened, the campfire burned down to a pile of glowing, ruby-red embers, softly pulsing with a hypnotic heat. The men slowly drifted off to sleep, their breathing falling into a slow, steady rhythm, matching the quiet murmur of a distant, unseen creek winding its way down the mountain. The mules stood with their heads bowed, dozing peacefully in the shadows. Elias lay back on his bedroll, looking straight up. Through a small gap in the immense branches overhead, he could see the sky, out here untouched by the smoke of industry or the glow of city gas lamps. The Milky Way was not just a faint smear of light. It was an explosive, diamond-dusted river pouring across the heavens. Millions of ancient stars burned with a cold, steady brilliance, casting a faint, silvery illumination over the tops of the sleeping giant trees. It was a view of the cosmos so vast, so incredibly beautiful, that it made all the worries, all the politics, and all the frantic rushing of the world seem utterly insignificant. He pulled the heavy wool blanket closer up to his chin, feeling the reassuring weight of it against the mountain chill. The wind began to sigh through the upper canopy of the sequoias, a sound that was deep and resonant, like the slow bowing of a cello. It was the lullaby of the old world, a sound that had echoed through this hidden valley for thousands of years, unchanged and uninterrupted. As his eyes grew heavy, the flickering embers of the fire blurred into a soft, warm glow. The ancient guardians of the forest stood watch in the dark, their massive trunks rooted in the quiet earth, protecting the sleeping travelers under a blanket of endless glittering stars. The transition from night to dawn in the high Sierra Nevada does not happen all at once. It is a slow, deeply gentle process, a gradual softening of the dark that begins long before the sun actually crests the jagged granite peaks. The deep, bruised indigo of the night sky slowly gave way to a pale, frosty lavender. The countless stars that had burned so brightly through the night began to dim, fading one by one into the cold, quiet expanse of the morning atmosphere. The air was biting and crisp, holding that distinct, sharp purity that only exists at high elevations, a cold that wakes up the lungs and sharpens the senses. Frost had settled over the camp during the darkest hours, dusting the wool blankets, the canvas packs, and the leather saddles with a fine, glittering layer of silver crystals. Elias was the first to stir. He lay still for a long time, listening to the absolute silence of the ancient grove. It was not an empty silence, but a heavy, insulated quiet, padded by millions of pine needles and the thick, spongy bark of the towering giants surrounding them. He took a slow, deep breath, pulling the freezing, pine-scented air into his chest, and watched as his breath formed a delicate plume of white mist that drifted up and dissolved into the morning chill. Reluctantly, he pushed the heavy, dew-dampened wool blanket off his shoulders, the cold air rushing in to replace the trapped warmth of his bedroll. His leather boots were stiff with frost, and he spent a quiet minute working his feet into them, lacing them up with slow, deliberate movements. The rest of the camp was still asleep, their slow, rhythmic breathing forming a soft, soothing bass line to the morning. Elias walked carefully toward the stone fire pit, his boots making soft, crunching sounds against the frost-stiffened forest floor. Beneath the layer of gray ash, a few stubborn embers from the night before still glowed with a faint, pulsing, ruby heat. He gathered a handful of dry, pale yellow pine grass and some incredibly thin twigs of cedar, arranging them gently over the embers. Getting down on his knees, he blew softly into the ash. A tiny, fragile ribbon of gray smoke curled upward, followed by a sudden, bright crackle as a small orange flame caught the dry grass. Elias fed the fire slowly, methodically, adding thicker branches until a steady, warm blaze was established, pushing back the biting chill of the dawn. There is a very specific comfort in the routine of a frontier morning. Soon, the rhythmic clinking of cast-iron cookware began to echo softly through the trees. A heavy black iron skillet was set over the flames, and thick, unevenly cut strips of salted bacon began to sizzle, releasing a rich, savory aroma that cut right through the cold mountain air. A battered enamel coffee pot, blackened by hundreds of campfires, was filled with water from a nearby stream and nestled directly into the hot coals. When the water reached a rolling boil, handfuls of coarsely ground coffee beans were dumped directly into the pot. The smell of that strong, rustic cowboy coffee, mingling with the wood smoke and the sweet, resinous scent of the sequoia, created an olfactory tapestry that was deeply grounding, signaling to the sleeping men that it was time to rise. One by one, the men unrolled from their blankets, stretching sore muscles and moving toward the magnetic warmth of the fire. They stood with their hands outstretched toward the flames, cradling tin mugs of the dark, steaming coffee, warming their cold fingers against the hot metal. They spoke in hushed, low voices, still largely stunned by the massive wooden pillars standing all around them. Now, in the growing light of day, the true scale of the giant sequoias was even more overwhelming. As the sun finally broke over the eastern ridge, it did not hit the forest floor immediately. Instead, it struck the very tops of the trees, hundreds of feet in the air. The highest branches suddenly glowed with a brilliant golden-green luminescence, looking like islands of light floating in the sky. Slowly, the golden morning light began to slide down the massive trunks, revealing the deep, rich cinnamon color of the bark. Elias walked up to the tree they had slept beneath. He reached out and pressed the palm of his hand against the bark. He was entirely surprised by the texture. He had expected it to feel like the hard, unyielding armor of an oak or a maple. But the surface of the sequoia was soft, almost fibrous, and spongy to the touch. He pressed his fingernail into it, realizing that the bark was incredibly thick, perhaps 2 feet deep in some places. This was nature's perfect insulation, a thick, protective shield designed by the slow, deliberate hand of evolution to protect the living heart of the tree from the inevitable lightning strikes and the naturally occurring forest fires that swept through these mountains every few decades. In fact, as Elias looked closely, he could see deep, blackened scars at the base of several nearby trees, hollowed-out caves carved of fires that had burned centuries ago. Yet, the trees stood tall and perfectly healthy, having simply healed their wounds and continued their slow, silent march upward into the sky. After a hearty, quiet breakfast, the work of the day began. The men unrolled long, heavy canvas measuring tapes, the fabric making a soft, continuous shh sound as it was dragged across the thick carpet of dried needles. They worked with a slow, focused rhythm. Wrapping the tape around the base of one of the mid-sized giants, the surveyor called out the numbers in a quiet, awestruck voice. The circumference was nearly 100 feet. It was a number that defied the standard geometry of the world they knew. They spent the entire morning moving methodically through the grove, documenting, sketching, and measuring. The forest was entirely free of the dense, tangled underbrush that choked the woods of the east. The sheer size of the sequoias, combined with the thick layer of needles on the ground, prevented much else from growing, creating long, cathedral-like aisles of open space between the massive trunks. It felt like walking through a meticulously maintained park, designed by giants. The only sounds were the soft, muted footfalls of the men, the occasional scratch of Elias's charcoal pencil in his leather journal, and the distant melodic trill of a mountain chickadee fluttering high up in the canopy. Around noon, the sun was directly overhead, sending thick, dusty beams of light down through the branches, illuminating millions of tiny floating dust motes dancing in the silent air. The temperature had risen to a comfortable mellow warmth, and a deep, drowsy peace settled over the valley. It was then that Elias stumbled upon the fallen monarch. Resting half buried in the soft earth, a short distance from the main cluster of trees, lay the body of a sequoia that had finally surrendered to gravity. It must have fallen decades, perhaps centuries ago. The root system at the base was entirely exposed, a massive, flat wall of intertwined wood that stood over 30 feet high. What fascinated Elias was how incredibly shallow the roots were. Unlike the deep tap roots of other trees, these giants spread their roots outward, barely a few feet below the surface, interlocking their subterranean arms with the trees around them. They survived the fierce mountain windstorms not by standing alone, but by holding on to one another, a vast, interconnected web of silent support hidden just beneath the soil. Elias climbed slowly onto the side of the fallen trunk. It was so wide that it felt less like a log and more like a raised wooden highway stretching off into the forest. He walked along the massive cylinder, his boots sinking slightly into the thick, emerald-green moss that had claimed the decaying wood. He walked for over 200 feet before he reached the point where the top had snapped off. Here, the cross-section of the tree was exposed, a smooth, weathered face that offered a direct, physical window into deep, unrecorded time. He knelt down on the damp moss and ran his fingertips over the concentric rings of the wood. Each ring, some no wider than a piece of thread, represented a single year of the tree's life. The slow, hypnotic rhythm of the forest seemed to emanate from this very spot. He began to trace the lines backward from the outer bark. Moving in a few inches, he passed the year 1776, a time when a group of men in powdered wigs were signing a Declaration of Independence in a sweltering room in Philadelphia, completely unaware that this tree had already been standing quietly in this hidden valley for thousands of years. He moved his finger deeper, inches turning into feet. Here was 1620, the year the heavy wooden hull of the Mayflower scraped against the cold, rocky shores of Massachusetts. He moved further still, passing the year 1492, when Columbus was nervously scanning the horizon of the Atlantic. Deeper and deeper into the heartwood he went, the rings blurring together into a dizzying timeline of human history. By the time his finger rested on the very center, the absolute core of the tree, he had traveled back before the fall of Rome, before the construction of the Colosseum, back to a time when much of human history was still lost in myth and shadow. Sitting there on that ancient fallen wood, surrounded by the mellow golden light of the afternoon and the deeply calming hum of the forest, Elias felt a profound sense of relief wash over him. The chaotic, noisy struggles of mankind, the frantic rush for gold in the valleys below, the political tensions brewing back in Washington, all of it felt so incredibly small, so fleeting against the slow, enduring pulse of this forest. The trees did not rush. They did not worry. They simply stood, breathing in the mountain air, drinking the snowmelt, quietly observing the passing of centuries, as if they were nothing more than passing clouds. As the afternoon slowly lengthened into the evening, the men packed away their canvas tapes and notebooks. They sat back around the cold fire pit, their bodies pleasantly tired from the day's gentle labor. The shadows began to stretch and lengthen once more, painting the forest floor in deep, cool shades of gray and blue. The wind picked up, just a gentle rhythmic sigh moving through the very tops of the sequoias, a sound so soft and constant it sounded like the ocean rolling onto a distant sandy shore. The mules shifted their weight lazily, their eyelids drooping in the fading light. Elias closed his journal, the leather cover soft and warm under his hand. As he watched the first stars begin to blink into existence in the pale evening sky, he felt his own heartbeat slow down, matching the deep, tranquil, and eternal rhythm of the American wilderness. The transition from dusk to true night in the deep Sierra Nevada is a masterclass in absolute subtlety, a slow, mesmerizing fading of the world that lulls the mind into a state of profound, undisturbed tranquility. As Elias and his men sat around the cooling ashes of their daytime fire, the colors of the forest began to drain away, replaced by infinite velvety shades of charcoal, slate, and midnight blue. The great trunks of the giant sequoias, which had glowed with such a fiery, vibrant cinnamon hue in the late afternoon sun, now stood as massive, darkened silhouettes against the fading sky, looking for all the world like the towering, silent columns of some ancient, roofless temple. The wind, which had been a gentle, playful breeze during the daylight hours, now settled into a low, steady, rhythmic sigh high up in the canopy. It was the sound so consistent, so deeply resonant, that it felt less like moving air and more like the slow, heavy breathing of the mountain itself. To keep the creeping high-altitude chill at bay, the men went about the familiar, deeply comforting ritual of building the evening fire. There was no rush to their movements, no frantic energy. Every action was slow, deliberate, and steeped in the practiced rhythm of frontier life. One of the men, a quiet, heavily bearded surveyor named Thomas, took up a small, sharp hatchet. The rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of the blade biting into a dry piece of fallen pine echoed cleanly through the grove. A crisp, percussive beat that was instantly swallowed by the immense acoustic dampening of the thick bark and the deep carpet of needles. He split the wood into thin, fragrant splinters, the sharp, clean scent of fresh pine sap instantly piercing the cool night air. They arranged the kindling in a perfect geometric teepee over the glowing coals that had been carefully preserved beneath the daytime ash. As the new wood caught, a sudden brilliant bloom of golden light pushed back the darkness. The flames licked upward, twisting and dancing in a hypnotic fluid motion, casting long wavering shadows across the deeply grooved bark of the massive trees surrounding them. Millions of tiny glowing orange sparks detached from the burning logs and floated lazily up into the dark branches, drifting higher and higher until they were entirely indistinguishable from the cold silver stars beginning to prick through the black canvas of the night sky. The heat of the fire radiated outward, a solid, comforting wall of warmth that pressed against the heavy wool of the men's coats. They pulled their wooden crates and leather saddles closer to the hearth, arranging themselves in a loose, comfortable circle. The evening meal was a simple, sturdy affair, cooked slowly over the open flames. A heavy cast-iron Dutch oven was nestled directly into a bed of glowing ruby-red coals. Inside, a thick, hearty stew of dried navy beans, salted pork, and wild onions bubbled with a thick, rhythmic plop, plop, plop. The rich, deeply savory aroma of the simmering food drifted through the camp, mingling perfectly with the sharp, resinous smell of the cedar smoke. When the stew was finally ready, it was ladled carefully into battered tin bowls. The men ate in silence. The only sounds, the soft clinking of metal spoons against tin, the crackle of the burning wood, and the occasional satisfied sigh. Accompanying the stew were thick, hard biscuits, hardtack that had been carefully softened by dipping it into the hot, flavorful broth. It was a meal that warmed them from the inside out, settling heavily and peacefully into their stomachs, bringing with it a deep, satisfying lethargy. The sheer physical exertion of the day's work, combined with the heavy, oxygen-rich mountain air and the warmth of the food, began to work like a powerful natural sedative on their muscles and their minds. Elias sat back against his saddle, cradling a mug of steaming black coffee between his thick leather gloves. He let his eyes unfocus, staring deeply into the shifting, pulsing orange heart of the campfire. The flames seemed to move in slow motion, eating away at the dry wood, turning it from solid matter into heat, light, and delicate feather-light gray ash. As he watched the fire, his mind began to drift eastward across the vast, sprawling expanse of the American continent. He thought of the bustling, noisy streets of New York, filled with the clatter of horse-drawn omnibuses on cobblestones, the shouts of newspaper boys, and the frantic, ceaseless energy of a young nation rushing desperately toward the future. He thought of the grand marble halls of Washington, D.C., where politicians argued endlessly over the drawing of borders and the fate of Western territories. All of that felt so impossibly distant now. It felt like another planet. Out here, in the deep, silent embrace of the sequoias, time did not move in minutes, hours, or even days. It moved in centuries. Elias realized with a profound sense of awe that he was sitting in the middle of America's true antiquity. The European continent had its crumbling stone castles, its ancient Roman aqueducts, its towering Gothic cathedrals. But the United States, this wild, untamed, magnificent frontier, had something entirely different. It had living monuments. These trees were not built by human hands. They were pulled from the earth by sunlight and rain, standing as silent witnesses to the turning of the earth long before the first maps were ever drawn. It was a deeply comforting thought, a realization that the land itself held a quiet, enduring wisdom that outmatched any human endeavor. As the coffee in his mug cooled, Elias felt an overwhelming desire to step away from the comforting glow of the firelight and experience the absolute purity of the night. He set his tin mug down on a flat stone, pulled the collar of his heavy wool coat up around his neck, and quietly stepped backward, slipping away from the circle of his men. The moment he stepped past the reach of the firelight, the darkness swallowed him completely. It took several long, quiet minutes for his eyes to adjust to the profound lack of light. But slowly, the forest began to reveal itself. In the dark, the moon had not yet risen, but the sheer brilliance of the Milky Way provided a faint, silvery illumination that filtered down through the immense canopy. The pale starlight caught the edges of the deep grooves in the sequoia bark, giving the massive trunks a ghostly, ethereal glow. He walked slowly, his heavy boots sinking deeply into the soft, spongy carpet of centuries-old pine needles, silencing his footsteps completely. It felt as though he were walking on a thick velvet rug. Without the distraction of vision, his other senses heightened, expanding outward into the quiet woods. He could feel the dramatic drop in temperature, the crisp, biting cold that seemed to purify the air, making every breath feel like drawing liquid ice into his lungs. He could smell the complex, layered fragrances of the forest, the sharp tang of juniper, the sweet, dusty scent of dry bark, the damp, earthy aroma of the soil, and the faint mineral smell of snowmelt running over granite somewhere in the distance. He walked until the campfire was nothing more than a tiny, flickering orange star in the distance. Here, standing at the base of a tree so wide he couldn't even see the curvature of its trunk, he stopped and tilted his head back. He looked straight up, the impossibly straight, unbroken column of wood, following it up, 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 into the dizzying heights of the canopy, where the dark, jagged silhouettes of the branches seemed to physically brush against the glittering tapestry of the stars. The scale of it was dizzying. He felt incredibly small, yet entirely safe, as if he was standing under the protective gaze of a benevolent, silent guardian. A sudden, soft, rustling sound caught his attention. He held his breath, standing perfectly still. A few yards away, a large shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness of the underbrush. A mule deer, moving with liquid grace, stepped softly into a patch of starlight. It paused, lifting its delicate head, its large ears swiveling to catch the faintest sound. It looked directly toward Elias, but sensing no threat from the quiet, still man, it simply lowered its head and began to gently pull at a patch of frost-covered mountain grass. The absolute peace of the moment, the man, the deer, the ancient trees, all existing quietly under the turning stars, was a perfect, flawless snapshot of the untouched American West. Eventually, the deep, biting cold began to seep through the thick wool of his coat, signaling that it was time to return. Elias turned and slowly made his way back toward the warm, inviting beacon of the campfire. When he arrived, he found that the camp had already settled into slumber. The men were wrapped tightly in their heavy canvas bedrolls, arranged like spokes around the hub of the fire pit. The flames had died down to a low, steady bed of pulsing embers, throwing off just enough heat to keep the immediate circle warm. Elias unrolled his own sleeping gear, a thick layer of canvas lined with heavy woolen blankets. He removed his stiff leather boots, setting them close to the stones to keep them warm for the morning, and slipped fully clothed into the bedroll. He pulled the heavy fabric up over his shoulders, tucking it in tight around his neck to trap his body heat. The weight of the blankets was immensely comforting, pressing down on his tired muscles like a gentle, heavy embrace. He lay on his back, staring up at the canopy one last time. The rhythmic, soothing sigh of the wind moving through the high branches acted as a natural lullaby. It was a sound that had not changed in 3,000 years. A sound that washed over his exhausted mind, sweeping away every lingering thought, every worry, every piece of mental clutter. His eyelids grew heavy, fluttering shut, opening briefly, and then closing for good. His breathing slowed, deepening until it matched the slow, steady rhythm of the sleeping men around him. The forest stood watch, vast and indifferent, cradling the tiny, fragile camp in its ancient wooden arms. Elias drifted downward, sinking into a deep, dreamless sleep, enveloped in the absolute silent majesty of the giant woods. Hours passed in the blink of an eye. The night moved steadily across the sky, the constellations wheeling silently overhead. When the earth finally began its slow tilt back toward the sun, the atmosphere in the high Sierra underwent a dramatic shift. The crisp, clear air of the night met the warming moisture rising from the valley floor, creating a thick, heavy blanket of morning fog. Elias awoke not to the bright, piercing rays of the sun, but to a muted, pearlescent gray light that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. He opened his eyes, blinking slowly, feeling a deep, refreshing heaviness in his limbs. The forest had completely transformed. The fog was incredibly dense, a rolling, swirling ocean of white mist that hugged the forest floor and wove its way through the massive trunks. It was so thick that the trees seemed to fade into nothingness just 20 feet above the ground, their upper halves completely swallowed by the clouds. The mist acted as a powerful acoustic dampener, wrapping the camp in a cocoon of absolute, profound silence. The sounds of the morning, the shifting of the mules, the crackle of the newly built fire were muffled and soft, lacking any sharp edges. Everything felt suspended in a dream. The air was heavy with moisture, and tiny glittering droplets of condensation clung to every pine needle, every strand of canvas, and the soft, woolly fabric of the blankets. Sitting up slowly, Elias breathed in the damp, fog-chilled air. It tasted clean, tasting faintly of crushed stones and wet cedar. The camp moved with a slow, almost reverent quietness, nobody wanting to break the magical, ethereal spell of the misty morning. They drank their thick, dark coffee in silence, watching the gray fog swirl and eddy around the massive, cinnamon-colored trunks. Today, they would have to pack their mules and leave this specific grove behind, continuing their long, arduous journey south to map the rest of the mountain range. But as Elias watched the mist moving like slow, gray ghosts among the giant trees, he knew that the quiet, ancient peace of this place would remain deeply rooted in his soul forever. The thick, pearlescent fog clung to the ancient bark of the giant sequoias like a damp, heavy blanket, wrapping the morning in an absolute, undisturbed hush. Down on the forest floor, Elias and his small crew of surveyors moved with a slow, deliberate grace, unwilling to shatter the profound quiet of the grove. Breaking camp in the deep wilderness of the American West is an art form, a meticulously choreographed routine that relies on muscle memory and a quiet respect for the elements. In the muted gray light of the misty dawn, every sound was softened. The sharp metallic clank of a tin coffee cup being packed away sounded more like a dull, distant thud. The rustle of the heavy canvas bedrolls being folded was reduced to a soft, rhythmic swish, swish, swish that seemed to blend perfectly into the gentle dripping of condensation falling from the massive branches high above. The air was saturated with moisture, carrying a deeply refreshing chill that settled into the lungs and woke up the mind without any sudden jolt. It smelled heavily of wet earth, crushed granite, and the deeply sweet, almost citrus-like scent of damp cedar and pine resin. Thomas, the heavily bearded surveyor who handled the pack animals, moved slowly among the mules. The animals stood with their heads bowed in the mist, completely relaxed, occasionally exhaling long, thick plumes of white steam from their velvet noses. Thomas spoke to them in a low, rumbling murmur, a soothing bass line of sound that kept the animals calm as he brushed the overnight frost from their thick, coarse coats. Saddling the mules was a process that could not be rushed. If a pack is unbalanced by even a few pounds, it will rub against the animal over the course of a 20-mile march, causing sores and slowing the entire expedition to a halt. Thomas hoisted the heavy wooden pack saddles onto their backs, the stiff, cold leather creaking softly in the damp air. He reached underneath the mules' bellies, pulling the woven mohair cinches tight with a slow, steady pressure. The heavy canvas panniers filled with flour, salted pork, cast iron skillets, and tightly rolled topographical maps were hoisted up and hooked onto the wooden crosstrees of the saddles. Then came the ritual of the diamond hitch. It is a classic piece of American frontier ingenuity, a complex geometric knotting of thick hemp rope that secures a load so tightly it essentially becomes part of the animal itself. Thomas threw the heavy rope over the top of the canvas packs, the rough hemp making a satisfying, raspy friction sound as it pulled tight. He looped it around the cinch ring, pulled it back up, and locked it into the shape of a diamond across the top of the load. He leaned his entire body weight back against the rope, his heavy leather boots digging into the soft, spongy layer of wet pine needles, securing the knot with a final muted grunt of effort. Elias stood by his own horse, a sturdy deep bay gelding with a calm, intelligent eye. He ran his bare hand down the horse's warm neck, feeling the powerful, steady pulse of the animal beneath its sleek coat. He threw his heavy, fleece-lined western saddle over the horse's back, the heavy leather flaps settling into place with a dull, heavy slap as he pulled the leather latigo strap through the rigging ring to tighten the girth. The familiar, comforting smell of well-oiled horse tack, a rich blend of tanned leather, neat's foot oil, and dried sweat, rose up to mingle with the cold morning air. It is a scent that, to anyone who has spent time in the saddle, speaks instantly of long journeys, open spaces, and the deeply grounding rhythm of the trail. With the fire completely drowned in water from the nearby creek, leaving nothing but a cold, wet pile of black charcoal and gray sludge, the expedition was ready to move. Elias swung gracefully up into the saddle. The leather creaked and groaned under his weight, a sound that would become the steady, hypnotic metronome of the day. He clicked his tongue softly, a subtle, almost imperceptible command, and gently nudged the horse's ribs with the heels of his leather boots. The horse stepped forward, its iron-shod hooves sinking silently into the thick carpet of ancient needles. The string of pack mules fell into line behind him, connected by slack lead ropes that swayed gently back and forth like the pendulum of a grandfather clock. They rode slowly out of the grove, leaving the monumental giants behind in the fog. As they moved south along the western slope of the Sierra Nevada, the profound silence of the sequoias gradually gave way to the quiet, subtle noises of the awakening mountain range. For the first 2 hours, the trail was nothing more than a faint, narrow ribbon woven through the dense timber, created over centuries by the slow, seasonal migrations of deer and black bears. The fog remained thick, limiting their vision to a few dozen yards. It felt as though they were riding through a cloud, isolated entirely from the rest of the bustling, rapidly industrializing world back east. There were no telegraph wires here, no steam locomotives tearing across the landscape, no factories churning black smoke into the sky. There was only the slow, swaying motion of the saddle, the deeply relaxing sway of the horse's hips, and the soft, rhythmic jingle of the brass bit chains. By mid-morning, the topography began to shift. They were slowly descending from the high-altitude plateau, following the natural winding contours of a massive granite ridge. As they dropped slightly in elevation, the atmosphere began to warm. The pale, diffused gray light of the misty morning slowly brightened into a brilliant, glowing white, and then all at once the sun broke through the cloud cover. The lifting of the morning fog in the Sierras is a spectacular, deeply uplifting event. The mist didn't just vanish, it tore apart in long, ragged ribbons, revealing patches of an impossibly deep, vibrant cerulean blue sky. The sunlight hit the wet forest canopy, and suddenly the entire world seemed to glitter with millions of tiny, dazzling diamonds. The temperature rose quickly, turning the biting morning chill into a comfortable, deeply soothing warmth that soaked through the heavy wool of their coats and settled into their bones. Elias reached up and unbuttoned the collar of his coat, letting the warm mountain breeze graze his neck. As the fog completely burned off, the true scale of the landscape revealed itself. They had transitioned out of the sequoia belt and entered a vast, sprawling forest of towering ponderosa and sugar pines. The ponderosas were magnificent in their own right. Their bark formed in large, flat jigsaw puzzle plates of deep burnt orange and golden brown. When the sun baked the trunks of these pines, the sap warmed up and released a fragrance that is utterly unique to the dry western mountains, a rich, incredibly sweet scent that smells almost exactly like warm vanilla extract and baking butterscotch. The men breathed it in deeply, letting the sweet, warm air fill their lungs, an intoxicating contrast to the cold, damp morning. The rhythm of the ride settled into a deep, hypnotic lull. Creak, sway, step. Creak, sway, step. The gentle rocking motion of the saddle is uniquely powerful in its ability to calm the human nervous system. It is a steady, predictable vibration that travels up the spine, loosening tight muscles and gently rocking the mind into a state of peaceful, drifting observation. The men rode in a long, single-file line, the mules following obediently, their long ears flopping forward and backward in time with their slow, steady footfalls. No one felt the need to speak. The beauty of the undisturbed California wilderness demanded a respectful, appreciative silence. They rode across vast, open slopes, blanketed in low-growing manzanita bushes, their smooth, twisted branches a deep, vibrant mahogany red against the pale, dusty green of their leaves. The trail occasionally broke out of the timber and onto massive, exposed domes of solid gray granite. These ancient rocks had been scraped and polished perfectly smooth by massive, slow-moving glaciers millions of years ago, long before the first human beings ever set foot on the continent. The horses' iron shoes struck the hard stone with a bright, clean clink, 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 a sharp acoustic contrast to the muffled thuds of the forest floor. Off to their right, the mountainside dropped away, revealing a sweeping panoramic view of the vast San Joaquin Valley stretching out like an endless ocean of pale gold and dusty green, fading into the hazy purple distance. It was a view that made a man feel delightfully small, a stark reminder of the sheer, unfathomable expanse of the North American continent. Out here, the anxieties of modern life felt completely irrelevant. The slow, ancient heartbeat of the earth was the only rhythm that mattered. Around noon, they paused in a high alpine meadow to let the animals rest and graze. The meadow was a perfect hidden bowl of lush, emerald green grass, bisected by a narrow crystalline stream fed by the melting snowpack far above. Elias stepped down from his saddle, his boots hitting the soft grass. He loosened the latigo on his horse, allowing the animal to expand its ribs and take a deep, contented breath. He slipped the heavy iron bit out of the horse's mouth, replacing the bridle with a simple leather halter, and let the animal wander over to the stream. The men found patches of warm, sun-baked grass and lay back, pulling their hats down over their eyes to block the bright, high-altitude sun. The sound of the mountain stream was a constant soothing babble, water tumbling gently over smooth, rounded river stones, creating a soft, liquid static that instantly heavy-lidded their eyes. The horses and mules grazed peacefully, the rhythmic tearing of the thick grass and their low, satisfied snorts blending with the sound of the running water. A warm, fragrant breeze swept down from the higher peaks, rustling the tall pine grass and bringing with it the dry, clean smell of sun-baked granite. It was a moment of perfect, undisturbed rest, a deep, restorative pause in the middle of a massive wilderness. For nearly 2 hours, they simply existed in that quiet meadow, absorbing the profound stillness of the mountains. Elias lay with his hands folded across his chest, feeling the solid, unyielding support of the earth beneath him. He listened to the high, distant cry of a red-tailed hawk, circling slowly in the thermals far above, a tiny speck against the vast blue canvas of the sky. The sheer peace of the moment was heavy, wrapping around him like a warm quilt, making the idea of moving on seem almost impossible. But the blank spaces on the map called to them, and eventually the slow, familiar routine of cinching saddles and packing gear began once again. The afternoon ride was characterized by a long, slow descent. They were following the natural drainage of the mountain, looking for a path down into one of the deep, uncharted river canyons that carved their way through the western slope. As the sun began its slow arc toward the western horizon, the quality of the light began to change. The bright, blinding white of the midday sun softened, taking on a rich, liquid amber hue. This is the golden hour of the American West, a time when the harsh edges of the landscape are smoothed over, and every rock, every tree, and every blade of dry grass is painted in deep, glowing shades of gold, copper, and bronze. The shadows grew long and soft, stretching out across the trail ahead of them. The air began to cool rapidly, the crisp, sharp edge of the approaching evening returning to the atmosphere. The trail steepened, weaving back and forth in tight switchbacks down the side of a massive granite wall, and then, as they rounded a particularly sharp bend in the rock, the ground simply vanished, and the world opened up in a way that took their breath away. Elias pulled softly on the reins, his horse coming to a dead stop. The rest of the pack train halted behind him. They found themselves standing on the edge of a massive, awe-inspiring precipice. Below them lay a valley of such staggering scale and beauty that it defied human imagination. Massive, sheer walls of pale gray granite plunged thousands of feet straight down, forming a monumental gorge carved by an ancient river of ice. The walls were glowing in the late afternoon sun, catching the amber light and reflecting it back with a warm, fiery intensity. Far, far below, winding through the very bottom of the gorge, was a river. From this height, it looked like a thin, winding ribbon of liquid silver catching the light and sparkling against the dark, forested floor of the valley. The sheer depth of the canyon created a profound echoing silence, a vast volume of empty air that seemed to swallow all sound. It was an astonishing discovery, a hidden kingdom of stone and water tucked away in the deepest folds of the Sierra Nevada, completely unknown to the bustling, industrialized world back east. A deep, calming wave of pure awe washed over the men. They sat in their saddles for a long, long time, simply staring out into the immense void. The wind swept up from the canyon floor, carrying the faint, distant rushing sound of the mighty river below, a sound that was ancient, powerful, and deeply soothing. Low, constant roar, softened by thousands of feet of distance until it sounded like a long, steady exhalation of breath. Slowly, carefully, they began the treacherous, winding descent down into the canyon. The switchbacks were narrow, the horses and mules stepping cautiously, their hooves searching for solid footing on the loose stone. The descent took hours, the rhythmic clinking of the horseshoes against the rock providing a steady, meditative beat to the journey. With every 100 feet they dropped, the temperature shifted, the dry, thin air of the high rim giving way to the heavier, damp, sweet-smelling air of the valley floor. By the time they finally reached the bottom, the sun had dropped behind the towering western wall of the canyon. The valley was plunged into deep, cool shadows, though the very highest peaks of the granite walls above them still glowed with a brilliant, fiery orange light against the darkening blue sky. They rode out of the dense forest and into a massive open meadow right beside the wide, sweeping bend of the river. The sound of the water was omnipresent now. It was no longer a distant whisper, but a deep, powerful, rushing presence. The river was wide and clear, tumbling over massive, smooth boulders that had fallen from the cliffs centuries ago. The water was a stunning shade of pale glacial turquoise, pure and freezing cold, carrying the heavy, clean scent of melted snow and crushed minerals. They made camp in the soft, high grass of the meadow a short distance from the riverbank. The routine of the evening was performed in a state of deep, contented exhaustion. The saddles were pulled off, the canvas packs unloaded, and the mules were turned out into the rich, knee-high grass. As the men built their fire, the last traces of sunlight faded from the peaks high above, and the deep, heavy blanket of the mountain night settled over the canyon. The heat of the campfire was a profound comfort against the creeping chill of the river valley. The flames danced and flickered, reflecting off the dark, moving surface of the river just a few yards away. They ate their evening meal in silence, the heavy cast-iron pot of beans and salted pork providing a deep, warming nourishment to their tired bodies. The sheer physical effort of the day combined with the thick, oxygen-rich air of the valley floor pressed down on them like a soft, heavy weight, inviting sleep. Elias sat on his saddle, leaning back, watching the dark water rush by. The sound of the river was incredibly hypnotic. It was a constant tumbling rush of white noise, a complex symphony of water wrapping around stone, dropping into deep pools, and bubbling over shallow gravel beds. It was a sound that completely washed out the mind, erasing all thoughts, all worries, leaving only the pure physical sensation of the present moment. He unrolled his canvas bedroll on a flat patch of soft sand near the edge of the grass. He slipped out of his boots, placing them neatly by the fire, and slid down into the heavy woolen blankets. The cold night air brushed against his face, but beneath the thick layers of wool and canvas, his body was perfectly, deeply warm. He closed his eyes. The massive, dark walls of the canyon stood like ancient sentinels on either side, completely isolating them from the rest of the world. The stars began to appear in the narrow strip of sky visible directly above, twinkling with a cold, steady light. As he lay there, the sound of the river began to work its magic. It was a constant rolling vibration that seemed to match the very beating of his heart. It smoothed out his breathing, slowing it down, down, down. The gentle rhythmic swish, swash, tumble of the water over the smooth stones was nature's ultimate lullaby. His muscles, sore from the long day in the saddle, finally let go of their tension, melting down into the soft, supporting earth. The fire slowly died down to a bed of glowing cherry-red embers, softly pulsing in the dark. Wrapped in the immense quiet safety of the deep canyon, surrounded by the ancient rushing waters and the silent towering walls of stone, Elias drifted downward into a profound, heavy, and dreamless sleep, completely surrendered to the endless, beautiful rhythm of the wild American frontier. The morning did not arrive all at once in the deep, hidden bottom of the canyon. Instead, it seeped in with an agonizingly beautiful slowness, a gentle dilution of the night that took hours to fully unfold. Because the massive vertical walls of pale granite towered thousands of feet into the sky on either side of the river, the sun had to climb incredibly high before its direct rays could ever hope to touch the valley floor. For Elias, wrapped tightly in the heavy, comforting weight of his woolen blankets and thick canvas bedroll, this meant that the dawn was simply a prolonged, peaceful twilight. The absolute darkness of the midnight hours slowly gave way to a soft, cool, bruised purple, which then melted seamlessly into a pale, translucent gray. The air was heavy, thick with the moisture of the rushing river and the freezing, crisp chill of the high Sierra Nevada night that had settled perfectly into the basin. Elias kept his eyes closed for a long time after he first became aware of the morning. There was absolutely no reason to rush. Out here, completely disconnected from the frantic ticking clocks of the eastern seaboard, time was measured only by the slow arc of the sun and the steady, endless rushing of the water. He focused entirely on the sound of the river just a few yards from his head. It was a hypnotic, tumbling roar, a constant rolling vibration that seemed to have woven itself into his very heartbeat overnight. The water crashing over the smooth ancient river stones created a complex, layered symphony of white noise, a deep, resonant bass where the main current surged, and a lighter, tinkling melody where the water bubbled gently against the sandy banks. It was a sound that completely washed the mind clean, dissolving any lingering thoughts of the civilized world, leaving only a profound physical sense of absolute peace. When he finally opened his eyes, he saw that a thick, silvery mist was rolling off the surface of the freezing river, drifting lazily over the tall, damp grass of the meadow. The mist clung to the ground, swirling in slow, deliberate eddies around the blackened stones of their fire pit and the sleeping forms of his men. The air he breathed in was sharp, pure, and tasted distinctly of wet granite, crushed pine needles, and the clean, mineral bite of melting snow. He shifted his weight, the heavy canvas of his bedroll making a soft, muted rustle against the damp earth. His muscles were deeply relaxed, heavy with the deeply satisfying lethargy that comes from long days of physical travel and nights of undisturbed, perfect sleep in the open air. Slowly, methodically, the camp began to stir. There were no voices at first, only the quiet, familiar sounds of frontier men going about their deeply ingrained morning routines. The strike of a flint, a sudden bright spark, and the delicate crackle of dry cedar shavings catching fire. Within minutes, a small, cheerful orange flame was pushing back the cool gray dampness of the valley floor. The fire was fed slowly piece by piece until a solid bed of coals was established. The heavy cast iron coffee pot, battered and blackened by hundreds of fires across the American West, was filled to the brim with freezing, crystal clear river water and nestled directly into the heat. As the water began to boil with a soft, rhythmic thump, thump, thump against the metal lid, Elias walked slowly toward the edge of the river. He knelt down in the soft, wet sand, cupped his hands, and splashed the freezing water over his face. The shock of the cold was instantly invigorating, pulling him entirely into the present moment. He stood up, wiping the water from his beard with the back of his heavy woolen sleeve, and finally took the time to truly look at the prison of stone they had descended into the night before. It was, without a single doubt, the most magnificent natural architecture on the face of the earth. The valley was surprisingly wide and incredibly flat, a stark contrast to the violently jagged peaks that surrounded it. It was blanketed in a lush, emerald-green meadow, dotted with groves of towering black oaks and fragrant, deep-green ponderosa pines. But it was the walls that defied all human comprehension. Massive, sheer faces of solid, pale gray granite rose straight up from the valley floor, climbing perfectly vertically for 3, sometimes 4,000 feet. They were so massive that they created their own weather, completely blocking the wind and holding the quiet, heavy air of the valley in a state of perpetual calm. And then, as Elias let his gaze drift along the northern wall, he saw the waterfalls. In the hazy, diffused light of the early morning, they looked like ribbons of pure white silk falling from the very heavens. Because the cliffs were so incredibly high, the water did not simply crash to the bottom in a heavy, solid sheet. Instead, as it fell, the sheer velocity and the resistance of the air tore the water apart. By the time it was halfway down the immense cliff face, the waterfall had transformed into a slow-moving, undulating curtain of fine white mist. It fell with a bizarre, slow-motion grace, drifting back and forth against the dark gray rock like a ghost, finally settling into the deep, dark pine forest at the base of the cliff with a soft, distant, continuous thunder. The scale of the place was so incredibly vast that it tricked the human eye. Trees that Elias knew must be 200 feet tall looked like tiny, insignificant patches of moss clinging to the base of the monumental stone walls. Looking at those cliffs, Elias felt a deep, overwhelming sense of reverence. This was not a landscape to be conquered, mined, or logged. This was a sanctuary. It was an ancient open-air cathedral built by the slow, grinding mechanics of deep time and massive, forgotten glaciers. As the sun finally crested the towering eastern rim of the canyon, the transformation of the valley was nothing short of miraculous. The very top of the western wall was suddenly struck by a brilliant, blinding beam of pure golden light. Slowly, over the course of an hour, that line of light crept its way down the sheer granite face, painting the pale gray stone in vibrant, glowing shades of amber, copper, and warm peach. When the sunlight finally hit the valley floor, it burned away the river mist in a matter of minutes, instantly warming the freezing morning air and releasing the incredibly sweet, heavy fragrance of the damp pine needles and the black oak leaves. The men spent the entire day moving slowly through the valley, their topographical instruments entirely dwarfed by the landscape they were attempting to measure. They rode their mules through the thick, waist-high grass of the meadows, the animals happily snatching mouthfuls of the rich green forage as they walked. The quiet was profound. Down here, protected by thousands of feet of solid rock, the furious howling winds of the high Sierra passes could not reach them. There was only the gentle rustle of the oak leaves, the distant, muffled roar of the great waterfalls, and the soft, rhythmic swish, swish, swish of the horses moving through the tall grass. Elias frequently found himself simply stopping, dropping his canvas notebook, and staring up at the sheer immensity of the stone monoliths that guarded the valley. One rock in particular dominated the western end of the canyon, a massive, singular block of granite that thrust straight up into the blue sky like a silent, unbreakable fortress. It was so completely devoid of fractures or ledges that it seemed impossible that nature could have formed it. It stood as a permanent, enduring monument to the quiet strength of the earth, a rock that had watched 10,000 years of sunrises and would watch 10,000 more without ever shifting a single inch. In the mid-afternoon, they stopped to rest near the base of one of the massive waterfalls. The air here was dramatically cooler, saturated with the fine atomized mist that drifted off the falling water. The sunlight caught the water droplets hanging in the air, creating brilliant, shimmering rainbows that danced and shifted directly over the soft, moss-covered boulders. Elias lay back against a massive piece of granite that had been warmed by the afternoon sun. He closed his eyes and let the deep, resonant, continuous roar of the falling water wash over him. It was a sound so powerful, yet so deeply consistent, that it acted as a heavy weighted blanket for the mind, pressing down on his thoughts and smoothing them out into a flat, calm surface of pure relaxation. As he rested there, listening to the heartbeat of the valley, Elias pulled his cracked, leather-bound journal from his heavy wool coat. He took his charcoal pencil and began to write, not measurements or topographical data, but his own thoughts. He wrote about the profound, undeniable stillness of this place. He wrote about the frantic, noisy, rapidly industrializing nation that existed just a few hundred miles away, a nation that was tearing up the earth in search of gold, laying down miles of iron railroad tracks, and filling the skies of the east with the black smoke of coal fires. He realized, with a quiet but absolute certainty, that this valley was different. This hidden sanctuary of stone and water possessed a value that could never be measured in ounces of gold or board feet of timber. Its value was in its silence. Its value was in its ability to make a human being feel incredibly small, to shrink the anxieties, the politics, and the endless conflicts of mankind down to their proper microscopic size. Elias wrote that this place belonged to the ages. He imagined a future where the weary citizens of a bustling, crowded America could travel to this quiet valley, look up at the glowing granite walls, listen to the slow, steady rushing of the turquoise river, and find the same deep, restorative peace that he was feeling right now. It was a quiet thought, written on a fragile piece of paper in the middle of an uncharted wilderness, but it was a thought that would eventually ripple outward. Decades later, during the darkest, bloodiest days of the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln would sign a quiet piece of legislation far away in Washington, D.C., officially protecting this specific valley and the giant trees that surrounded it. It was the birth of an entirely new, uniquely American idea, the concept that the most beautiful, awe-inspiring landscapes on the continent should be preserved completely untouched for the quiet enjoyment of everyone for all of time. But Elias did not know this yet. He only knew that the valley felt deeply, perfectly safe. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, crawling slowly across the meadow and climbing the opposite walls, the expedition slowly made their way back to their camp by the river. The evening in the canyon was just as prolonged and gentle as the dawn. Long after the sun had disappeared behind the towering western rim, the sky above remained a brilliant, glowing canvas of peach, lavender, and bruised indigo. The light slowly faded, slipping away into the cool, dark embrace of the mountain night. The men built their final campfire in the valley, a small, controlled blaze of dry oak and cedar that cracked and popped with a comforting, familiar rhythm. They ate their final meal in a state of deeply relaxed silence, the heavy, savory warmth of the food settling deeply into their tired bodies. The physical exhaustion of the day, combined with the incredibly rich, pure oxygen of the dense forest, made their limbs feel wonderfully heavy, as if gravity itself had gently increased its hold on them. Elias sat by the fire, watching the flames slowly die down. The bright, dancing orange tongues of fire gradually retreated, leaving behind a glowing, pulsing bed of ruby-red embers. The heat radiated outward, warming the front of his woolen coat, while the cool, damp night air pressed gently against his back. He drank the last of his black coffee, the heavy, bitter warmth coating his throat, and set the tin mug down in the soft sand. The transition to sleep was not a sudden event. It was a slow, beautiful surrender. The men unrolled their canvas bedrolls one last time, slipping out of their heavy leather boots and sinking down into the thick, protective layers of wool. The absolute darkness of the canyon was absolute, save for the faint, silvery starlight that pierced the narrow strip of sky directly overhead. The massive granite walls stood like silent, eternal guardians, completely blocking out the rest of the world, locking the camp inside a fortress of ancient, undisturbed quiet. Elias lay flat on his back, staring up at the narrow river of stars above. He focused all of his remaining attention on his breathing, letting it match the slow, steady, continuous sound of the river rushing over the stones. Inhale, the cool, pine-scented air filling his lungs. Exhale, the tension melting out of his shoulders, his back, his legs sinking deeply into the soft earth. The wind sighed very softly through the tops of the massive ponderosa pines, a deep, resonant shh that sounded like the very breath of the earth. The embers of the fire popped one last time, a tiny, quiet spark fading into the dark. The river rolled on, as it had for thousands of years, carrying the freezing snowmelt down from the high peaks, a constant liquid lullaby that washed over the camp. Every muscle in Elias's body let go. The heavy weight of the wool blankets felt like a warm, secure embrace. The grand, monumental silence of the American wilderness held him perfectly still. There was nothing left to map, nothing left to measure, nothing left to worry about. There was only the dark, the warmth, the slow, rhythmic breathing of the men, and the endless, soothing sound of the water. The massive stone walls watched over them, ancient and calm, as Elias drifted deeper and deeper, leaving the waking world behind, sinking into the profound, heavy, and perfectly peaceful sleep of the deep canyon night.